welcome to our 6th episode of Epic Christians of History. Today I brought a prop from my office mate Ted. It's Terry Francona, manager of the Indians, bobblehead as he's riding around on the scooter, his little motorcycle. And looking at today, I was reminded of people who ride on motorcycles typically are seem to be wanderers, kind of restless souls. And so I was reminded of our saint today, Augustine of Hippo. He was a bishop and he was born in 354 AD, lived to 430 AD, so 4th to 5th centuries there, kind of following after the time of Athanasius. And with Augustine we see that the church has transitioned from being a group of ragtag outsiders to insiders, to really an accepted part of society. And Augustine is actually able to realize from an early point in his life that he's rejecting the teachings of the church, and he finds himself living in substance abuse, living out some sexual escapades, and living far from the design of God for his life. And it's in the middle of that reality that Augustine, as he gets an education, starts hearing about the news of Jesus. That Jesus wants to save us from our sins, that Jesus has come into our lives to call us out of darkness and into light. And Augustine's famous book, Confessions, which tells the story of his life, he begins by saying, "Our hearts are restless until they rest in you," speaking of Jesus. And that was the story of Augustine's life, finding rest in Jesus, finding that grace. Augustine spoke out against a couple of heresies of his day, the Donatists, who said that once you rejected Jesus, you couldn't come back to the church, that if you ever turned your back on the church, you were not welcome back. And Augustine spoke to them and said, no matter who we are, whether we've just accepted Jesus or whether we've turned away from him and then come back, or whether we've been 50 years faithful to him, each one of us rely on God's grace. It's only God's grace that makes a difference. It's only God's grace that enables us to live a life of love and not of sin. Augustine also spoke against Pelagianism, which said that human beings could handle this whole salvation thing, that Jesus was just kind of a good reminder to us of who we're supposed to be, and that if we just learned enough and tried hard enough, we could be saved. And Augustine spoke against that and articulated the concept of original sin, that all of us are lost in sin, that all of us are wandering around from the moment that we're born looking for God's love to meet us. And it's only God's grace that brings us out of that. It's his choice, his decision that moves into our lives and shows us the love of Jesus. It's fascinating to read Confessions, City of God, and any of Augustine's writings. He's funny in a lot of areas, but always a very deep thinker and always cognizant of the truth and the love that is offered to us in Jesus. Concept that I think is interesting to think about is how Augustine begins to articulate just war theory, that there are times that Christians can take up arms. Up until now, it's generally been understood that Christians don't engage in violent resistance, that Christians are not soldiers. Augustine begins to argue that yes, Christians can be soldiers. Yes, there are times where we are called to defend ourselves, we're called to defend the innocent. And it's interesting to think of whether that was a scriptural change and how that looked in the life of the church and how that continues to look today. Augustine is probably the most influential figure on the church today from those first 3 centuries of Christianity outside the writers of the New Testament. So maybe those are a couple questions to think about today. First of all, how do we as a church do at proclaiming to the world the reality of sin and the reality of grace? How do we balance those two things? How do you think we're doing that? And secondly, maybe we can talk specifically about what you think about the just war theory versus more of a pacifist, nonviolent approach. Do you think that the church compromised the scriptural position when it became entrenched with the state? Or do you think that there needed to be a little bit of pushback to get Christians to the point where they realize that there is a time and place to take up arms to defend the innocent? These are questions that Augustine asks us to look at, and I think they're great questions for us to consider as believers as we remember a man whose life was transformed by the grace of God and who speaks of that grace in loving terms and reminds each of us that we need to rely on Jesus.